the 11th of July 1865, a 25-year-old artist called Edward Whymper set out in the Alps to climb a mountain thought to be unclimbable, the Matterhorn. He'd tried 7 times before, Swiss and Italian teams had tried, but on the 14th of July, he, a Brit, became the first man to get to the summit of the Matterhorn. No mountain was too high for the Victorians, the Conquerors. The Victorians were the ultimate conquerors, setting out to discover the world and make it their own. British explorers in their pith helmets, their solar topies, travelled the globe, pushing back the boundaries of the empire. People like David Livingstone spread British ideology and commerce right through the uncharted continents of Asia and Africa. For the early Victorians, much of the world remained unexplored, ready to be converted, but also exploited. The interior of Africa was plundered for diamonds and gold. At the same time, explorers were also discovering some valuable plants on the other side of the world. In fact, the transfer of just a few key plants changed the world forever. Control of materials like rubber became enormously important, as the Victorians eventually used it for everything from bicycle tyres to raincoats and Wellington boots. Unfortunately, most of the world's rubber came from Portuguese Brazil. The British wanted a slice of the action, so in 1877 they took seeds from Brazil to Malaysia and launched a new British-controlled rubber industry. Meanwhile, other plants were desperately needed for their medicinal properties.
One of the worst diseases facing man is malaria. All over the world, malaria was the big problem faced by the British colonies, by the administrators, and this bark holds the key to malaria. It is from this bark that you get quinine. The problem with quinine was that all the trees from which it came were under Spanish control. The British were desperate to get hold of quinine, as were the Dutch, so collectors were sent out to the Andes to look for the seeds and eventually send them back to Kew.
The British were then able to plant the seeds and harvest their own supply of quinine, essential protection against malaria for expat Victorians. Those English chaps working on the plantations in the Far East had a daily ritual for taking their quinine. They took it to ward off the malaria, and because it tasted horrible, they took it in a tonic. And then, of course, to help them drink it down, they mixed the tonic with gin. Ah, excellent, thanks very much. I'll have a slice of lemon. And lo and behold, they'd invented the gin and tonic. Cheers! The Victorians were exploring nature and mapping the world. But most important of all, they were the leaders of the pack. And they were determined to show it. So in 1851, they organised the greatest event of the age, the Great Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations. This was the world's first international exhibition, packed with over 100,000 shining examples of craft and technology from all over the world. An elephant's howdah from India competed for attention with a reaping machine from America, an 80-bladed penknife, and even a giant bed from Vienna, which was bought by the Queen. It was a truly international exhibition, and yet of almost 14,000 exhibitors, over half were British. Visitors from all over the world could plainly see Britain's industrial supremacy. But the most memorable part of any visit must have been the exhibition building itself, surprisingly inspired not by industry, but by nature. A lily, which grew thousands of miles away in the Amazon jungle. Just look at this extraordinary plant. The first seeds were brought back in 1846, 25 of them, and they were brought here to Kew, but they were very, very difficult to grow. In fact, of those 25, only 2 germinated, and both those plants died. But a greenhouse designer called Joseph Paxton cultivated a plant which did finally produce flowers. And he was so pleased and proud of it that he called it Victoria in honour of the Queen, and he gave her a flower. This particular species is Victoria cruziana. Now, extraordinarily, the structure of the leaf actually gave him a new idea about how to build greenhouses. Paxton's inspiration came from this. This is the underneath of one of those giant lily leaves, and all these veins and so on, he just took these and replaced them by iron ribs. Paxton realised that by scaling up the design of one of his greenhouses, he could build a huge modular structure of iron and glass. In a flash, he had thought up the Crystal Palace, the most radical building of the age. And this is where it all happened, London's Hyde Park. In 6 months, more than 6 million people flocked here to see all the wonders of the world in the Crystal Palace, the most innovative building in the world, built right here on this stretch of grass. The extraordinary thing is, there's no trace of it now, nothing on the ground, no plaque, it's not even shown on the maps. But we are going to change all that. Finding its exact position is a matter of detective work. So I've enlisted the help of Ken Kiss, an expert on the Crystal Palace, who has some essential clues. Ken, hi.
Oh,
Hi. Now, I've read about the Crystal Palace, but I gather you think you know where it was.
indeed, yes, I think we've got the exact position by using this photograph. You'll see here it shows this lodge building, which still
it's this
stands.
one?
Indeed.
You mean the thing? It was right there.
Just there, where the trees are in the background.
The
that's
front
where it
entrance.
was. Exactly the spot.
So the Queen would have driven up in her carriage and gone in here.
Indeed she would. And with the aid of the railings and the building, the position of the two, we were able to get the correct angle that the photograph was taken and thereby mark out the line of the building.
Brilliant. So that's wonderful mathematical detective work. So, can we go and sort it out on the ground?
Yes, of course.
Let's do that.
And that's it, 450.
There. So this is the corner of the building.
That's the corner of the building
Right. Oh, we should have stopped for a coffee now. Anyone the other side? Hope for the best.
And that's the spot there.
There.
Yes, just
Okay.
there.
We've had horses on it.
Yes.
And here we are. This is the centre point. It's absolutely huge. It's 1,000 feet that way, 1,000 feet that way, and incredibly wide beyond the trees on both sides. It's an enormous space. From above, the vast scale of the Crystal Palace can really be appreciated. It actually covered about the same area as the Millennium Dome, and it was built in just 6 months. I would really love to know what the Crystal Palace looked like. And so we've challenged a small iron foundry to build just a corner of it, a tiny little bit, to the original specifications, right here in Hyde Park. I can't wait to see what it's like.
We've got to work out how we can mould it. We're going to have to work out how we cast it. Now, in Victorian days, all that was done very, very quickly. It was all created in next to no time, but lots and lots of people were involved in it. And we've only got one chance at this, so we don't get lots of time to practice.
The original building was constructed from over 3,000 iron sections, cast in foundries across the Midlands. The girders and columns were transported to London by canal boats and on the new steam railways to be bolted together in Hyde Park. This was the first time any large building had been built from prefabricated units of iron and glass, making it a forerunner of the modern skyscraper.
Beautiful.
150 years later, Dominic can only hope that his parts will be up to the standard of the Victorians.
It's looking good. This is the moment of truth. You ready for this? Look at that. Isn't that fantastic? I'm very, very pleased with that. It looks absolutely excellent. And it's number one of 28 more pieces. Fantastic.
Iron wasn't just the heart of the Crystal Palace, it was the mainstay of new Victorian engineering, the very stuff from which the spreading arteries of empire were built. All over the world, iron was paving the way for the relentless spread of the Victorians over land and sea. But it wasn't all plain sailing. In spite of the grandeur of their wonderful new steamships and the amazing technology, they did have the occasional technical hitch. Iron hulls brought strength and speed to ships, but they also introduced a new problem because they interfered with the crucial process of navigation. All that iron had a serious effect on the compass. Look at this. This is my compass, and you can see that north is in that direction, almost exactly in the direction of that weather vane. And if I stick my compass in a wooden boat, it doesn't affect true north. It still points in the right direction. But look what happens when I put it in an iron boat. You can see that it begins to spin. And in some places in the iron boat, it's much worse. Look at that. It's now pointing over there. It's about 30 degrees wrong. If I believed this compass, I'd probably go crashing into Greenland or something like that. This was a serious problem. Well, the great scientific minds wrestled with it, and they realized it must be possible to compensate by using magnets. And so they began to experiment. It took the great mind of a brilliant scientist called Lord Kelvin to solve the problem. He invented a system that used groups of magnets which could be arranged around a ship's compass to counteract the effect of the iron hull. And he called his invention the binnacle. This is where the compass is, mounted so it can swing in any direction and compensate for the rolling of the ship. And it says the Lord Kelvin compass card here. And in this wooden housing is a very complicated array of magnets, big vertical correcting magnets there, a heeling bucket here, look, a bucket with magnets in it that you lower in on a chain to exactly the height you need to compensate for the heeling of the ship. And here are the Kelvin spheres, soft iron balls that you can move in and out like this, and on the back, the Flinders tube with yet more magnetic correction. With this wonderful bit of high technology, the British sailors had a considerable advantage, at least for a time, over their maritime rivals. But there was one thing even the Victorians could not control: the weather. However, they did try to predict it, using a rather unusual method. The trusty leech. This weird contraption was invented by one somewhat eccentric Victorian in an attempt to forecast storms. This is a tempest prognosticator, and it was first shown by its inventor, Dr. George Merriweather, at the Great Exhibition of 1851. Now, this is not the original. This one's been lovingly rebuilt by Phil Collins here at Barometer World in Devon. Phil, you had to follow his original design, I gather.
That's right. We're fortunate that there's a surviving line drawing from the Great Exhibition catalogue, and so we've gone to meticulous detail in copying it in every way. It's one of the most absurd methods of forecasting or foretelling the weather, as they would have said back then, and it's based on leeches.
So, explain to me how it works now.
If it's going to be stormy weather, one would expect the leeches to try and get out, and to do that they go through this little brass tube and push that little bit of white bone there, and that releases the trip, which is attached to this wire here, and that's attached to the chain, which comes up here to the little hammer,
Right.
and rings the bell.
Oh, I see. So it's all gravity, leech-assisted gravity.
That's right.
There was some method behind Merryweather's design. The idea was that leeches move around in response to changes in electrical activity before a storm. So, can the leeches tell us whether there's a storm brewing today? Go on, jump, jump. Go on, it's very stormy. It's a tense moment. He's going for it. Climb, climb. Go on, thunder. Dr. Merryweather wanted to create a national network and have these distributed all the way around the country, but unfortunately he couldn't get the money to pay for it. And anyway, they aren't terribly reliable. I'm not sure that I'd want to risk a transatlantic voyage on the feelings of 12 leeches. However, the idea of a national network really was a good one, and it was taken up by another man, Admiral Robert Fitzroy. He wanted to tackle the weather with the appliance of science. Barometers were already in use to measure pressure changes, which were known to be useful in predicting the weather. Fitzroy wanted to use barometers in his network, but the trouble was that all the barometers he came across were fragile, complicated, and often utterly unreliable. So what he did was to design a really good barometer, and these were made all the same, standardized, and sent all around the country. And it's a beautiful thing. Look, it's got a very accurate thermometer in the front and the barometer in the top here with simple instructions printed on it, so that even someone who'd never seen one before would be able to use it. Now, with these, he was able to get weather reports from 24 different stations all around the country. And he reckoned he could actually predict what was going to happen the next day. In fact, he coined the term weather forecast. From 1861, his weather forecasts were actually printed in the Times. The trouble was that he didn't always get it right. It's very difficult. But he blamed himself when it went wrong. And in a fit of depression, on the 30th of April, 1865, Admiral Robert Fitzroy went into his bathroom and cut his throat. International trade was expanding rapidly. Cotton picked in Egypt or America was being shipped over here, spun and woven in the mills in Lancashire, and then the cloth was being shipped out again and sold in the Far East. All the people involved in this trade needed to communicate, and quickly. But in 1837 there were no phones, no faxes, no email. How were they going to send messages across the vast expanse of the oceans? The answer to long-distance communication was the electric telegraph. The electric telegraph was first used by railways for simple signalling using codes, like the dots and dashes of the Morse code. Soon, ordinary people were able to send and receive telegrams. A network of telegraph cables spread rapidly across Britain. But to lay cables across the world was not nearly so easy, and connecting Britain to America was the greatest challenge of all. John Packer is an expert on submarine telegraphy. John, tell me how it became possible to send messages across the Atlantic.
It was a development of the early telegraph systems that were used on the railways and on inland networks. And I can demonstrate here the sort of things that we use.
Right.
We start off with a battery.
Yes.
We connect the battery to the sending device, which is something that looks rather like two Morse keys. We then go along our line to the receiving end,
Right.
which is simply a needle on a dial, which moves to the left or to the right as the left or right key are pressed.
Oh, so you have a code then? Left,
It's
right, left,
similar
right.
to Morse code, so left and right on the key, represented left and right on a needle of the receiver, and equated with the dots and dashes of the Morse code.
Now, do you think we could get it to work over this vast stretch of water here?
Well, we could have a go.
What was the first transatlantic cable?
A great problem and very much of an experimental disaster. The boats they used weren't really big enough. There were several attempts to lay it, and the most successful was when two vessels carried half the cable each. They met in mid-Atlantic, they spliced the ends together, and then the ships sailed in opposite directions, paying out the cable and talking to each other through the cable to ensure that it was still okay.
That was really cunning.
They got eventually one unbroken piece of insulated copper between this country and North America, and the signals were very weak and feeble, so they kept increasing the voltage and ended up with about 2,000 volts.
2,000 volts?
Naturally, the cable died on them.
I'm not surprised. How did they manage to do it in the end?
They hired the world's biggest boat at that time, which was the Great Eastern.
Oh, yes.
That could carry almost the entire length in one go.
Paddle wheels made the Great Eastern very manoeuvrable. And to stop the 2,000-mile-long cable from snapping, the ship was equipped with a massive gearing system to lower its load gently onto the seabed. Right, John, let's go. So, which one do we connect it to?
Line, there we are,
Line.
the line goes on.
And that's it, just one connection.
Switch to transmit and we're ready for it.
Okay, you stay there, send me a message when I get over there and I'll see if I can pick it up.
Right.
Let's see if it's going to work. Send your signal! Yeah, look, it works. The needle's moving. Right, now I can send one back. Fantastic. Telegraph cables were soon straddling the world. Cables from America, India and even Australia fed into this tiny beach near Land's End, Porthcurno Bay in Cornwall. So, Mary, the cables actually run right under our feet, is that right?
Yes, from the cable hatch at the top of the beach, under here and out to sea.
Out to sea, fantastic. Yeah. Why Porthcurno Beach?
Well, as you can see, it's very sandy, there's no rocks, and the sand extends a long way under the sea, which was what gives the sea this lovely colour. And so there's nothing to rub the cables or damage the cables. Also, there's no boats here, and they weren't. It was very, very quiet, so there are no anchors to drag and damage the cables.
And this is actually a specimen of cable.
This is a piece of cable, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It has the message goes through the core, then it's surrounded by an insulating material.
This is gutta percha.
Yep.
Lovely. And this is just steel, is it?
Steel armouring.
Right.
The cable was subject to damage at the bottom of the sea with the tides. You can imagine with a storm.
Yeah.
You've got it potentially rubbing on rocks further out to sea. But you've also got some animals, sharks, if you call them shark an animal.
Yeah.
But they attracted to the magnetic field somehow and took the odd bite. So something like that means they don't make a second bite.
At the head of the bay, the cables all fed into a single shed, a hub of Victorian communications.
This is the hut where it all happened. Yes.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes.
Great. It's not exactly a palatial residence, is it?
No.
Gibraltar. Do you mean this cable's going all the way to Gibraltar?
This piece of cable here is actually one physical link between here and Gibraltar, going down the beach, under the sea, up the beach at the other end, and originally into a hut like this at the other end.
Fantastic. Now, why are the three to Gibraltar?
Well, when they first laid one,
yeah,
they could send one message at a time. So if they wanted to send two messages at a time, they had to lay two cables.
Oh,
and if they wanted to send three, they had to lay three cables.
Right. And do they stop at Gibraltar?
This particular section will stop, but then they will be started again with another section which will go from Gibraltar to Malta, then another section which went from Malta to Alexandria.
Yes.
So it goes on until you get to Bombay.
All the way to Bombay?
Yep.
From this hut?
Yes.
Are they still connected? Can I shout down? Hello? Anyone there?
No, I'm sorry.
It's no good.
You get an answer.
So how many cables were there altogether?
There were 14 here at its peak in the early 20th century, making it the biggest telegraph station in the world.
Really?
Bizarrely.
This hut?
It was. Hard to believe, but it was.
Equipped with a worldwide network, the Victorians were able to rule over a truly global economy. Even before Victoria came to the throne, ports like Liverpool were trading centres, but they would soon become important in another way. By 1840, these ports were packed with a more precious cargo, people, because the trading had shown that foreign lands were packed with riches and people wanted to go out there and collect them. Now, Liverpool was one of the main ports, and during Victoria's reign, something like 5 million people left this very port to seek a better life in the New World. Most were bound for New York. In 1860, that was a 9-day journey, for which many of them sold all their belongings to pay the £5 fare. And Britain, the conquering nation, attracted settlers too. Hundreds of thousands of people from all corners of the empire came to Britain to seek a new life here. There was no greater celebration of the multicultural empire than the Great Exhibition of the Crystal Palace. And Dominic Grosvenor now has his chance to recreate a part of it. It took more than 2,000 men over 6 months to assemble the iron modules of the original building. We're attempting to erect a corner in just 1 day. The first column erected in Hyde Park for 150 years. Now let's hope they can get the others up and the glass in too. 300,000 panes of glass, each an unprecedented 4 feet long, were hand-blown by French and Belgian experts.
Can you see the distortion and movement?
Yes,
in that?
there's all sorts of lumps and bumps and stuff.
Now, if you hold that up to the trees or where you've got natural light, it'll sparkle and it'll refract light beautifully.
And when the ironwork was glazed, the magazine Punch, as a joke, called the building the Crystal Palace, and the nickname stuck. Well, it's done. At least it's almost done. We've got the whole of the frame up, all the cast iron, and we've got 3 sheets of glass in, just to get a hint of what it must have looked like. It must have been absolutely wonderful with this handmade glass all shimmering in the sunshine. I just think this is the most wonderful structure, and I'm delighted to have just a hint of what the original must have looked like. 6 months in construction, 6 months open, and 6 million visitors, all to enable the world to experience the achievements of the world's greatest conquerors, the Victorians. To the Crystal Palace, the 2001 Crystal Palace. Cheers! Cheers! More and more people had disposable income to spend on things other than essentials. In the Victorian era, you could make a lot of money if you had some luck and a really good idea. One chap who did just that up here in Northumberland was William Armstrong, who spotted the power in moving water and made himself a fortune. William Armstrong began his career as a lawyer, but his real passion was engineering. He invented hydraulic machines that transformed industry, and he became one of the richest men in Britain. And this, Newcastle, is where he made his money. The thing was, in 1837, when Victoria came to the throne, Britain was world leader in production of iron and steam engines. And we'd just recovered from the economic disaster of the Napoleonic Wars. So there was tremendous boom in imports and exports. And the docks here in Newcastle were fantastically busy. Armstrong invented the hydraulic crane, the perfect tool for getting all the goods onto the ships and off again. The principle of hydraulics is really quite simple. Just look at these 2 syringes. One is much bigger than the other. If I push this big plunger down a little bit, watch how much the little one moves. You see, it's moving up about 5 times as fast. So you can get 5 times the movement. But the really clever bit is to run it in reverse. If I put a little weight on here, it'll lift a much bigger weight the other side. 1 kilogram shoved on there would lift 5 kilograms on the other side. So you can use hydraulics to multiply force. Armstrong's business grew to become the biggest on the Tyne. In 1868, he even had an entire bridge demolished, replacing it with a hydraulic swing bridge to enable ever bigger ships to get to his works. After almost 130 years and 250,000 swings, it's still in perfect working order, and its keeper, George Fenwick, promised I could have a go at working it. So what's the first thing we have to do?
The first thing you're going to do is blow the horn.
Blow the horn. What, once?
3
times?
3 horns. Quick.
Right, I've done that.
5 turns on the water.
5 turns, which way?
Anti-clockwise. Come on, big strong lad like you.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, like that.
Like that, that's
Right.
smashing. Now if you take
This one.
this lever
Okay.
and
So
pull it
kick
across.
that.
Wait, wait. Now take your arms out. Pull that one back now.
That one back.
And now that one. Now you're ready to rock.
So I can turn the bridge.
Yes, turn the bridge. Quarter turn on the lever.
Quarter.
Anti-clockwise.
Right. Right. 1, 2, 3, go. Oh, it's easy. Oh, no, it's
That'll
not so
do.
easy.
You'll snap that.
By turning the controls, I'm releasing the water power to drive the hydraulic rams. The rams turn the gears, and the gears turn the bridge. Hey, we're moving. That's fantastic. This is William Armstrong's bridge, 1,200 tons of it, and I'm turning it. Look at that. Wow, I'm driving a bridge. William Armstrong used all the money he made from hydraulics to jump onto another bandwagon. He made guns and warships, and he wound up employing 20,000 men. He was the biggest industrialist in the country, and that brought its own rewards. At Rothbury, in the heart of the Northumbrian countryside, William Armstrong built Cragside, one of the most luxurious houses in Britain and the first in the world to be powered by hydroelectricity. He got his power by bringing water down these cast-iron pipes from Nellymoss Lakes, 100 metres up the hill, and of course it arrives here with tremendous pressure. And he used all that pressure of water to drive this turbine. In here there are buckets being forced round by all that water. And once he's got that rotary motion, he's able to generate electricity using this generator. And he made 10 kilowatts of power. Armstrong used his electricity to make his house a showcase of the latest Victorian technology. Even members of the royal family couldn't resist an invitation. Cragside became known as the Palace of the Modern Magician. In the bedrooms, there were electric bells to summon either the maid or the valet. And when it was time for dinner, they saved muscle power and lung power by using an electric dinner gong. Electric fire alarm. He even had a telephone. Hello? Hello? Basically, it was to call for more power from the powerhouse, but of course he was one of the first people in the country to have a telephone, so he couldn't phone anybody else. But the most amazing thing about Cragside was this, the electric light. Cragside was the first house in the world to be equipped with the light bulb, developed by Armstrong's close friend, Joseph Wilson Swan. And this is it, or at least this is one of his very, very early ones, made by his own hands. Beautiful object with a hair-thin carbon filament in there. Swan had struggled for almost 20 years to make his light bulb. Like other inventors, he knew that if electricity could be used to replace dim candlelight and smelly gas, there were fortunes to be made. The problem was actually making it work. Here is my light bulb. Everyone knew that if you took a wire filament like this and passed a current through it, it would glow, and that was the whole principle. But there was a little bit of a problem. Just watch this. Now, I'm going to pass my current through, gradually increasing it, but oxygen in the air gets to the filament, hot spots develop, and it simply burns out. They realized that what they needed was to keep the oxygen away from the filament so that it wouldn't burn. Now, they used vacuum pumps, but I'm going to cheat. This is easier. I'm using liquid nitrogen. It's boiling off furiously, blowing out all the oxygen and filling the flask with nitrogen gas. Now, that means with luck there'll be no oxygen in there for the filament to burn in. I'll try now putting some electricity through my filament, hoping for the best. There we are, and it seems to be glowing nicely. Terrific. It's really bright. It's not burning out because it's in an atmosphere of pure nitrogen. There, look at that. I'm lit up by an incandescent lamp. I've invented the light bulb. From water power to electric light, Victorian inventors were making it big. But the living conditions of the new industrialists stood in stark contrast to those of the thousands of workers they employed. In overcrowded cities, most people had to live in cramped and squalid conditions.
After a terrible epidemic of cholera swept through Bradford in 1848, a rich mill owner called Titus Salt decided his workers deserved a better deal. So he embarked on an ambitious project to build them a utopia out in the countryside, away from all the pollution and disease. Salt chose a beautiful spot in the heart of the Aire Valley, and he called it Salt Aire.
Salt owns 7 woolen mills in Bradford. So, to get all his workers under one roof at Salt Aire, he needed to build a mill of unprecedented size.
Up here on the top floor is what used to be the biggest room in the entire world.
It's an incredible space, almost 200 yards long. There were hundreds and hundreds of workers in here. A massive production line. Every day, the factory produced 18 miles of cloth. But the mill was only the beginning. Over the next 23 years, Titus Salt built a whole town. Along streets named after his family and even his wife's friends, he built 800 houses for his workers. He built shops, schools, a community centre, and a hospital. He even provided allotments so that the residents of Salt Aire could grow their own fruit and veg. In fact, there was almost everything you needed, except a pub. When Titus Salt died in 1876, 100,000 people came to mourn his passing, and he was buried in the church that he had built. Titus Salt had thrown down the gauntlet to the other great industrialists of the day. He was one of a new breed of philanthropists who realized that when you employ thousands of workers, you have a real responsibility to the community. For the mid-Victorians, business was booming, but it wasn't all good news. More business meant more traffic, and London, the world's financial capital, was grinding to a halt.
But that in itself was a business opportunity. If anyone could solve London's traffic problems, they'd make a fortune. The only trouble was there wasn't any space to build new roads. So perhaps the answer was to build a new railway underground.
In the 1880s, private investors took a huge gamble on a radical electric transport system 100 feet below London's streets. Mike, it's very dark in here. Where are we?
You're standing at the bottom of one of the shafts that was excavated to help in the construction of London's tube railways. The idea was basically to sink a series of shafts, which were basically where the stations were going to be for most of the railways, and then they could actually dig the running tunnels between the stations.
Whose idea was it in the first place?
Really, you can look to a man called James Henry Greathead, and he'd seen things like the construction of Lambeth Bridge, where people were using cast iron pipes to help form the foundations. And along with a colleague called Barlow, they came up with the idea, well, if you could turn this technology, this pipe technology, truly on its side, it would enable you to quickly, cheaply and efficiently dig tunnels under cities like London. This is one of the cast iron lined tunnels that was built using the Greathead shield.
How did that work?
It's a cast iron or metal ring which provides a safe working environment for the tunnellers, and it's actually almost like a pastry cutter, a 12-foot pastry cutter on its side with the sharp pointy edges into the clay, and it uses a sequence of rams which actually sit against these cast iron lining rings. They push it forward into the clay.
Yeah.
The clay is dug out, taken away from the tunnels, and when they've dug enough out, they retract rams, and then fit another of the cast iron lining rings in place.
Oh, dead easy. So that's what, 18 inches at a time?
That's it. Basically, these are prefabricated pieces of cast iron.
Right.
And of course, the Victorians were very fond of cast iron. It was a modern technological advance for them. And they developed systems actually of having separate styles of lining for the top of the tunnel. And if you look up there, you'll see it's marked T.
Oh, wonderful.
For top. And then further down on the side, you'll notice here that you've got O for ordinary.
Right.
And this was to help them put
So you
the
couldn't get
tunnel
it
back
wrong.
together. You basically couldn't get it wrong.
Tab A into slot B.
Precisely. It's a giant Meccano kit in many respects.
You mean I could do it?
Almost you
Mind
could
you, it
build
looks
one of
quite
these
hard work.
tunnels. Fairly heavy, but it saved, of course, having to use really skilled bricklayers to build vast lengths of these complicated tunnels.
And it must have been quick too.
It was remarkably quick. Once they got the technique sorted out, the bulk of London's central area tube network was dug in a little over 2.5, just under 3 years.
Wow, that is amazing, isn't it? The astute investors in what the Victorians christened the Tube made a wise gamble. In the first 2 weeks alone, they collected 165,000 twopenny fares. If you were a Victorian banker or an insurance broker, your whole livelihood depended on a few very special books, because in those days before electronic calculation, you needed tables like these ones, Calais 1795 log tables. This was the only way that they could assess risk. And these had to be accurate, because if they weren't, well, things could go badly wrong. It made the difference between wise investments and financial disaster. These tables were calculated manually by men called computers, and human error was wreaking havoc. One single mistake cost the government £3 million. But an eccentric inventor called Charles Babbage proposed a radical solution. What Babbage imagined was a mechanical computer. He'd reduced complicated calculations to simple additions, and he reckoned he could put together cogs like this that would do those additions automatically. Let me try and show you the basic principle. Suppose I want to add 7 and 5. Now I set this one up to give us 7 there, and I set the middle one up to give us 5 on your side, so that'll be there. That's 5. And now we're going to get the result out here, and I need to turn this one round so it's 0. So we've got 7, 5 and 0. Now all I have to do to get the answer is to turn this one back to 0. So I turn it round like this, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. There we are, 1, 2. The answer 7 plus 5 is 12. And that is the heart of Babbage's difference engine. Sadly, although he eventually spent £17,000 of government money, enough for 2 warships, he never did finish it. In fact, this, 1/7 of the machine, was all he managed to complete. The government, of course, were furious. One of them said, all we got for our £17,000 was Mr. Babbage's grumblings. We should at least have got a pretty toy for our money. And so they pulled the plug. They took away his financial support, and most of his parts were melted down for scrap. Babbage was certainly a genius. He dreamt up all sorts of things, including an even more advanced computer and flashing lighthouses. But none of these things made him any money, and he was a very miserable man. He hated buskers, for example. He complained he'd had to spend a quarter of his life listening to rotten street music, and he even managed to get an act through Parliament banning buskers. That made him very unpopular, and they threw dead cats at him, and even paid buskers to go and play outside his house. A sad end for the father of computing. Not all inventors thought big. It was often a better bet to come up with something small that people really wanted. And as Victorian literacy continued to increase, more and more people needed to write. For most people, that meant a quill pen like this. Now, quill pens are quite fun to use. You cut the thing diagonally, and then you write with it like this. But the trouble is they're very soft, and so it wears down, and sooner or later you need a new one. The only option was a handmade metal nib, probably a gold one like this. And these were far too expensive.
for most people. Joseph Gillett came up with the answer. He produced steel nibs. He adapted a button pressing machine and turned these out at $1 each, as cheap as the quills and as long lasting as the gold. It was a runaway success. In fact, he made so much money, he didn't know what to do with it, and he even started burying it in his cellar. But then he started collecting antiques, and he became an important patron of the arts. He actually discovered an unknown painter called Joseph Mallard William Turner. He went to visit him in his dingy house and offered to buy a painting. Turner, who was a grumpy artist, said no. And so Gillett said, "All right then, what'll you take for the lot?" And Turner was so amazed that he named an enormous sum of money, and Gillett calmly got out his wallet and paid him in cash. Well, Gillett made loads of money, but he could hardly have foreseen that the material he'd used for his pen nibs, steel, was about to transform the world. With buildings made of brick and stone, you could only build to a certain height because the building got too heavy. But once you had a steel skeleton and walls simply hung from it, you could build quickly and as high as you liked. The first steel frame building in the world was built in Chicago in 1885, and in 1896 they built one in England at West Hartlepool. It was a completely new way of thinking about building, and it opened the door, literally, to some rather confusing inventions. The revolving door was invented by Theophilus Van Kannel in 1888, and the idea was first to get all these people in and out of the building very smoothly. But actually there was a more fundamental reason. Because of all the hot air rising in the building, there were terrific drafts through ordinary doors and you couldn't get them open or shut. And then there was the escalator, which started life as a fairground ride, invented by Jesse Reno in 1891 and turned into a practical system by a chap called Charles D. Seeberger in 1899. But a big problem with these high buildings was that people weren't prepared to walk up more than about 4 flights of stairs. So the most important innovation of all was the safety elevator, invented in 1852 by Elisha Graves Otis. Most people thought that the idea of travelling in a lift was too dangerous even to contemplate. Otis was convinced he had a mechanism that would prevent the lift from plummeting to the ground even if the cable snapped. But nobody would believe him, so he had to become a showman, and he built a gigantic wooden model at the New York Exposition of 1853. Let me show you how it worked. When I pull down the rope, which is going to lift the lift, you see the rope's tightening up, and now this becomes horizontal, this spring compresses, and this spigot here disappears inside the lift car. But suppose the rope breaks like that, then what happens is that that spring pushes the lever down, pushes the spigot out, and so it's going to engage with these teeth. And that means that the lift cannot fall. That was the secret of Otis's mechanism. When Otis unveiled his huge construction in New York, he drew massive crowds. What they were about to see was a death-defying demonstration, which I'm going to try and repeat. A huge crowd gathered on the floor below while they winched Otis up to a dizzying height. When they got there, the platform swayed and the crowd gasped in anticipation. And then Otis called for his assistant to cut the rope. Go on, cut the rope! Hey, it worked! It locked up, I haven't plunged to my death. All the crowd were amazed, everyone was convinced. Sadly, Otis died at the age of 50 and never lived to see his wonderful invention transform the skylines of the world. But his elevators certainly made it big. But skyscrapers weren't the only invention to come from abroad. In the summer of 1868, the Velocipedamania came to this country from Paris. And about 50 firms rushed into production of funny machines like this one, which came to be called the Bone Shaker, although actually it's rather comfortable. I'm sitting on a bit of sprung steel. It's very heavy, and really, it was more a toy for rich young chaps, not a serious means of transport. Nevertheless, this was how the bicycle came to Britain. Not very good brakes on this. It's not very elegant getting off either. It was only about 18 months before the Bone Shaker was superseded by this, the ordinary or high bicycle. By pedalling a huge front wheel of up to 5 feet high, you could really get up speed, and more athletic gentlemen even began racing them. It was a real macho machine. The disadvantage is you've got to sit directly over that in order to reach your pedals, which means your face is up there somewhere. And that means if you hit a pothole, you go splat on your face. That was called taking a header. The market was wide open for someone with a bright idea to clean up. And in 1887, a Coventry tricycle repairman called John Kemp Starley introduced a design so brilliant that he made himself a fortune and he revolutionised the world of personal transport. This is an original Starley Rover or safety bicycle. And you'll see it's got two wheels the same size, and most important, it's got a chain so that I'm driving the back wheel, not the front wheel. And because the chain wheel on the pedals is twice as big as the cog at the back wheel is going round twice as fast as my pedals. So you can go very fast on this machine. Starley organised 50-mile and 100-mile time trials, and these bikes smashed all previous records. They saw the high bicycle off the road, and this bicycle design hasn't changed in more than 100 years. The cyclist didn't have the road to himself. He often got held up by a self-propelled vehicle. And this is it, the horseless carriage. Michael, this is a steam carriage, yes?
That's right, yes.
Aren't you a bit bothered having a great boiler with high-pressure steam underneath you?
It's not as big as all that, and there isn't that much steam down there, and I trust the engineers.
Victorian technology was ever advancing, and a brand new engine was about to change everything.
The steam carriage was coming to the end of the road because it was about to be overtaken by this. This is the petrol-driven car. Fantastic new high technology, isn't it wonderful? Unfortunately, the development of these things was held up by the Red Flag Act, originally 1865, which said that any horseless carriage had to be preceded by a man walking, waving a red flag to warn the other road users. And the maximum speed limit was 2 miles an hour in town and 4 miles an hour in the countryside. Michael, what happened to the red flag?
Well, 1896, the Act was repealed. It was no longer necessary for you to have a man walking in front of your heavy or light locomotive, and the speed limit went from the 4 miles an hour up to 12 miles an hour in the town. 12 miles an hour in the town and 14 miles an hour in the countryside.
Wow. And was there any sort of celebration?
Yes, there was. The Motor Car Club ran an event, a run from London to Brighton, just to prove to the public that motor cars were reliable. There was a man called Harry Lawson, either entrepreneur or charlatan, depending on your view, who'd come out of the bicycle industry and had bought up a whole lot of patents in the car industry, so that quite a lot of the cars taking part in this first run actually came from his manufacturers.
How many?
22 out of 33 were his.
22 out of 33. So presumably he won then?
No, he didn't. No, he got it all wrong.
Excellent.
Because two cars came over from America, the Duryea brothers, and one of those got to Brighton first, even though it wasn't a race. And Harry Lawson, of course, complained and said they'd cheated because they hadn't stopped for a luxurious lunch in Reigate, which is what the competitors were supposed to do.
Despite losing the race, Harry Lawson claimed victory anyway. He used the London to Brighton rally as a springboard to become one of the biggest early car makers, and he built himself an empire. The Victorian age was a tremendous time of opportunity for entrepreneurs.
They did amazing things for us. Everything from hydraulics to the motor car. And it was this that drove us into the 20th century. Now, are you ready? Right, to Brighton. And in the unlikely event that you get there first, mine's a pint. OK, let's take her away. Excellent.
Now then, he's a businessman, rap singer and a convict, but who is Benair Tapey? Storyville finds out in 5 minutes over on BBC 4, while next year on BBC 2, World Championship Snooker.